Good morning. The lecture of today will deal with a problem which is in a way deeper in the culture of architecture and urbanism in the last at least century. Even the problem itself is the problem of urbanity. How to have a shelter. If nature would be so good, we would not need shelters. But somehow, from the cave to the primeval hut, we somehow build things or arrange things to protect us from the weather, from enemies, from, in a way, give us privacy, as many things. So there's a book by a famous French architect called Viollet-le-Duc. Its name is L'histoire de l'habitation humaine, the history of urban dwelling, which in a way crosses through ages and places to understand what is a dwelling and how this is related on one side to the needs of living, our basic needs, on the other side to, one could say, an anthropology of living, how different countries, different climates respond to the theme. This means that the theme of dwelling is much, much bigger than everything I can stand in one single lecture. So the lecture is not about this theme in general, but it's more about a particular question that crosses, say, the last 100, 150 years of reasoning on architecture and urbanism and some kind of present state. That's the first part of my lecture. In the second part of my lecture, it will come to a very individual response to that, which means project about housing, collective housing, I, as an architect, as a practicing architect, I did. So it mixes some more general consideration to a very empirical experience. The start is what is our present cultural condition in respect to some problems we have. The first one could be the environmental emergency, we're all very aware of, in relationship to some kind of modern tradition. When I say modern, means something starts around the late 1800s, the early 19th century, and where the theme of dwelling is central to the modern experience. Of course, I cannot make the whole history of what is said and written and designed about dwelling. To simplify a lot, one could say after the Industrial Revolution, many people flew from the country to industrial cities, so there was a physical problem of giving a dignified dwelling to a lot of, in a way, peasants turned into workers. This was true in most of the industrialized worlds, also in Italy. Milano and Torino were industrial cities, but many people flew from the country to go to inhabit in them, and some conditions were really incredibly tough. I'm talking about Europe. Of course, these things could project it today in a global scenario. There's a famous writing by Engels, Marx and Engels, to somebody who has a left-wing culture could mean something, about the condition of living in, let's say, London in the second half of the 18th century, and it pictured a terrible condition of tightness, promiscuity, hygienic situation. It was in a way, looking at a very tough situation, which means at the turn of the century, dwelling was not the only theme which modernist culture, functionalist culture dealt with, but it was one of the central. The particular way it was approached was restarting from the unit, which is called, in a way, the single, what was called the living cell. It's interesting because the word cell itself refers to some kind of medical or biological process where you start from this unit. The way people approach this theme was in a way, transporting some of the techniques and way of analyzing of industrialization, in particular what is called Taylorism. Taylorism was an analysis of the movements of the worker in a way, production line, to minimize these movements and to, in a way, synchronize them with the machine. So a worker was, in a way, a piece of a machine, even if it's human, performing something. And studies about, for example, you have this architect called Alexander Klein, who made studies, very detailed studies about the minimum path between the kitchen and the table to try to give a rationalized solution to a kitchen, which means somehow Taylorist and industrialization thought was applied to the house, to the theme of a house, which actually is a big, deeper theme, because it has to do with our own existence. And there's a famous statement by Le Corbusier. It's called Machine Habitée, house as a machine for living, is a famous motto, where synthesized well the way the approach to housing was made. So in a way, the idea was to cancel the memory of existing houses, to restart with some kind of functionalist attitude, analyzing functions, sleeping, washing, eating, getting together, some kind of social life and so on. In a way, this was applied to sort of a typical family, you know, a mother and a father, 2 kids. These diagrams of rationalism, in a way, simplify the average family. So the idea of standard was at the base of this. This is very deep because the first machine age, as Henry Ford designed the Ford T, which was the car for everybody, even the Volkswagen, you know, Volkswagen means the car of the people. So in a way, the Maggiolino, the Beetle, was the car for everybody. So this idea that you could give one response that could fit all, one size fit all. So it was true also about the house. All this is the base of the way we approach still the themes of lodging, but many things occur in the meantime. Again, the environmental thing, the total change of lifestyles. We are reasoning today on patterns of living which are totally different from the one which were before. And one deeper problems, which touches another problem, what is the shape of the city? What is the relationship between the small unit of the cell and the wider environment of the city? So my lecture will not be about the unit itself, but more about how today think of interfaces between the single unit, dwelling unit, the private dimension, and the public one. Because that, to me, is even a bigger problem than this sort of existence minimum thing. Why I say that? Because many people felt that this sort of refoundation of the theme of what we call today, in a way, satellite quarters, peripheries, and so on, starting from the study of the unit, in a way, wanted the city, the exterior space, to this sort of inside-out reasoning, which is not really the way we conceived the city before. Many rationalist projects, for example, once they put together these cells, they analyze the distance between slabs, given that every house gets a ray of sun. There's a famous section done by Walter Gropius, which is a dilemma called high, middle, or low-rise houses, about orienting these slabs of units, these apartment complexes, in the right direction. So in the winter, the lowest house of the next. So the distances between 2 slabs is given by some kind of section of ray, and that's perfectly okay. The only problem that the resulting cities, it looks very different. It's made some kind of garden. It would be many times, you want it to be as a garden, but in reality it's parking cars. If you go to many peripheries today, what would have been a beautiful garden is sometimes a little bit of empty space. It's free, it's green, but it's not very socially used. And the distance between these towers, blocks, or these things is given by insulation. So you get a beautiful, sunny apartment, which of course has a lot of good qualities, in the middle of a space which socially is not somehow rooted in our way of being together, especially Italy, if you go to Italian cities, which means that Saturday afternoon, the people which live in these ordered, clean, rational suburbs, they all flew to the center of Rome, of Milano, of Aosta, and they don't stay there. We don't see yet people going from the historical center to these places. I'm not saying this is the goal. It means that the city which resulted by this attitude, which composes a great part of, it gives housing to a lot of population, is not totally corresponding effectively, socially, to what we feel like. Okay. After these long premises, I start with this reasoning. And I start reversing the process. I take a picture of what, in a way, an idealized but real view of the historical settlements. This is a French Languedoc, it's called Circulade. It's some medieval settlings which had a very strong circular form with the church, with the streets and the main square. And we can say everybody who looks at this image cannot feel some kind of pleasure or a feeling of naturality, which means the historical settlements were designed by us, so the artificial elements, but we feel them as a second nature. Somehow the spaces of the city, the public spaces host our need to be together, our social life, and the room hosts the private dimension, the idea to be protected. So you can see the historical city as some kind of join between two opposing, I would say, or complementary needs: to gossip, to go on the market, to talk about, not only to buy vegetables, but also to gossip. I think gossip is one of the main binding elements of human life. Now we don't gossip anymore, we gossip on Facebook. So the second important function of the square was not buying vegetables, was gossiping about your neighbor. And that does not happen anymore. And of course, you can also buy vegetables with Amazon Prime. That's an interesting question. But in the old times, we all keep this image in a very sort of deep association, which means this image is the typical image advertisement people use it for. It could be on a leaflet for a travel agency and so on, which means we feel the historical city as a second nature. We built it, but we feel it as a second nature. We live today in a city which works. We get on a car, enter a highway, exit the highway, go to play tennis in a bubble, go to an entertainment center, maybe to a service center, and then we come back and we shut the door of our apartment. And this is the city. This is a picture by Olivo Barbieri. It, in a way, represents in my mind what is the contemporary territory. Many people try to describe it. Some people call it edge city, sprawl. In Italian, you would say città estesa, città diffusa, so on. Middle landscape, some people call it. Some people say it's somehow surreal. I don't think it's surreal. I think it's more like TV zapping. In a way, when we zap the TV, our brain is very easily changing codes. If it's a reality show, and then it goes to a film, and so on, we are reframing very quickly. So when you enter the highway, you follow the codes of the highway. When you enter a gym, you follow the codes of the gym. And this works very well. In a way, if we build this city, it means we need it. So this city responds to our daily needs. But we miss something. I think what we miss is the fact that this functional specialization of the parts, it sort of separated the parts of the city in single entities and left some kind of black hole. The place today is the place for the migrants, for the gypsies, and is the leftover, while the historical city had a condition of overlapping. The same square could serve during the day to a religious celebration and then for restaurants. The other day I was in Verona. You have the Roman fragment, you know, the arena, you have the restaurants, then you go to there. You feel this overlapping of things. There's a word serendipity. It means in a historical city you can look for something and find something else. And today this seems to be lacking. The objects have separated. One could say today we go to have fun in an entertainment center, but in a way, if you're in Venice, you don't need a playground because the whole city of Venice is a playground. You have little playgrounds. But in a way, this is true for most of our lives. So we live in this city, we produce city, but something we feel, something even nostalgic about the old city. Most of the culture of last century was afraid of the metropolis, of the center. The metropolis was seen as evil, as a place full of conflict, chaos, and so on. So half or 3/4 of the reasoning about dwelling and urban form of last century was about, let's say, disurbanization. The movement of what was called the Siedlungen in German. There were these units, you have almost quite good ones. The idea was to make satellite quarters, something around, which were mostly devoted to dwelling. They had the services like maybe a primary school or some kind of shop, but the idea was to separate dwelling from the rest of city life in a way to reduce the overlapping. So the word zoning, you know, zoning was one of the key words of last century urbanism, was to make the industrial quarter, the residential quarter, the downtown, the service center, and so on, to separate the parts based on its function. So the quarters were sort of homogeneous, even if we guarantee the minimum services. And this generate to seeing the density of the metropolis as evil. Today, at least in Europe, the word density got some kind of new positive value. This is a book by say about new dwellings, and the title is density, new collective dwellings, which means we are reasoning on density not anymore as something, the word itself is not having any more negative association, and something goes back to have positive association. This for a number of reasons. Not the last one is we discovered that the suburbs is very, very uneconomical and negative from the point of view of sustainability. This is a diagram where it relates urban density and transport-related energy consumption. You see the yellow are the North American cities. You have Los Angeles, Detroit, Denver, which each inhabitant consumes 16 gallons of things per person, while Brussels, Munich, West Berlin, Vienna, the European cities, St. Antikyra, they consume 15, which means the transport-related energy is much, much more in the sparse cities than dense ones. This is a diagram of consumption of a single dwelling unit. The red is related to transportation, and the blue is related by the energy consumed by the building itself in heating, cooling, and that. So you have suburban, the first line, green suburban, compact, green compact, urban, and green urban, which means that the non-ecological, I would say, not designed to urban dwelling is much, much more, much less energy consuming than the suburban, and even in the green suburban, but even the compact, which means this is for many reasons. Of course, the one related to transportation is about distance, but also there's I could go into the mathematics of it, a compactness factor. Very simple, you could say, if you take 1 unit of volume of a suburban house, let's say you take, let's say 300 cubic meters. This means 100 square meters by 3 of height. Take a little cube or rectangle. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 faces in the air. So for each unit of volume, it has a lot of surface. This surface is what disperses heat. If we put them together in an apartment, the side which has the same temperature is much less, which means little puppies, cats, when they're cold, they all get together. They have the same volume, but touching somebody else, you have less surface. So the overall mass of little puppies getting together disperses less heat. You embrace in a way to disperse less heat, just very roughly. Galileo Galilei, in a famous paper, he explained, let's say, the mysteries of scale factor, which means if an object gets 10 times bigger, the surface becomes 100 times, but the volume becomes 1,000 times because it's proportional to the power of 2 or 3, which means an object which is 10 times bigger, in geometry this does not count. Some phenomenon of biology are related to the relationship between scale, in a way, the relationship of surface to volume. I don't go into it because it's a very complicated matter, but one could say the bigger, the less surface you have in respect to volume. In a way, an amoeba breathes and eats through its own skin. And if you think about it, the way our intestine is meander, or even our brain, one could say that the meander is a device of bigger biological beings to compensate the uneven relationship between surface and volume. Whenever you see a meander, it means you need more surface to interchange, to digest the thing, to breathe. If you look a bit, the smaller the beings, the less articulation they need. They have a lot of surface in relationship to volume, which means sometimes if you have a very, very big building, some buildings of, let's say, 60 meters depth, you start to do indentation, like in some New York hotels, because you need to get the air and the light inside the building. So if things are too small, they disperse too much energy, I'm simplifying, and you get to get them together. If things are too big, not enough air and light gets into the middle, not enough exchange with the environment, and so you get to get a meander. It's an interesting matter. Still, this means that for many, many reasons, the suburban type is very energy consuming. So in the end, we discover, as there's an American journalist who said, we discovered that the dense Manhattan is much more ecological than the idyllic Arcadian Vermont. This is a study from Leslie Martin. Leslie Martin was an English architect from the 70s. He made a book trying to put together with the mathematics all this. This is try to relate in population growth density and floor space ratio to understand the relationship between how sparse or compact a city should be. That's a very, very complex thing. I did, personally, I did a research with the Graz University. Brian Cody, he's the dean of the Form Follows Energy department. He's an environmental engineer. We worked together on experimental dwelling with a lot of low consumption. And I asked him, Brian, could we sit and go to drink a beer and discuss your thoughts about the energy question and the shape of the city? What do you think about it? You have more scientific instruments. And we can talk about it. You don't have a definite answer. It's very complex. To analyze the energy balance of a city has so many things. The question is, what are the things related to our design? But this is part of another lecture. In this case, there's an attempt to put together the type of the building with the, in a way, denseness of the city. Then Leslie Martin took his students. He gave them, let's say, some kind of like 200 meters by 200 meters. I don't remember the dimension. And with the same density, he made very abstract models of a city made of today we would call them urban villas. If you go in Naples, you have the Quartieri Spagnoli, which look a little bit like that. This is a city made out of courtyards. The project by Giorgio Grassi and Aldo Rossi, San Rocco, the magazine San Rocco is named after them. It could look like that. This is a little bit higher tower, mid-rise tower, this, and all the way to up towers. Of course, as you go up, you have more open space. This is a dilemma we have every day in doing new quarters. You know, if you go to city life in Milano, whatever, you find this dilemma. But all these are with the same numbers. The conclusion of Leslie Martin is that one number alone and mathematical reasonings cannot give the answer in a univocal way, because it's still what kind of fabric or city we want to live in. So still, he uses mathematical methods, and then he reintroduced the idea of, in a way, culture, a dwelling culture and urbanistic culture. This is interesting because many reasoning today, they use mathematical formulas, and they, in a way, are telling you the computer told me so. I don't believe in that. I still think the computer is very helpful in giving alternatives, but in the end, the choice is still a cultural choice. That's what I believe personally. Don't think when people said this is the result of a parametric study or whatever, is not the only solution possible. And this, in a way, diagrams of Leslie Martin demonstrate that. Today, the other great emergency is the environmental one. That's also another very complex issue. My personal belief, not as an architect, but as a citizen, is that the main factors to reduce the CO2 is not flying on a plane and making less kids. When I was in school, I remember on my book it says the people was 3 billion. The world population was 3 billion. Now it's 7 billion. So in my lifespan, the amoeba in the glass doubled. That's scary in a way. Okay? It's a fact, but it's scary. And Africa is exploding. You know, the birth rate is credible. So your problem of next generation, what will happen in Africa? Because Africa is, in a way, not only Africa, of course, but that's, I think, the new century thing. But those are things which relate us as citizens, as politicians and activists, not as architects. The architects are trying to translate these worries into projects, and these are taken from magazines which show some kind of sense of guilt we have in relationship to nature, and some attempts to put together this issue about density and the issue about natural. In this case, I find these images very seductive, but in a way very formalist. You certainly have, and this happens to me in my professional life every day, you feel a building with trees because when you are in competitions, nobody can say anything. When two people in two jurors of competition, they fight, they can like or not like. If your building is full of trees, how can everybody be against nature? So I think that in the presentation of the architects, the tree is some kind of device that should appeal to everybody. Who can say, no, I don't want this? Because you pretend you're defending nature by itself, putting in Photoshop all these trees, and then nobody can say anything anymore. So I find in many of these projects some kind of even dishonest, I would even say, thought. This does not mean that we're not reasoning on integration. We have very good examples in Milano. Also Milano, in a way, did and realized examples of integrating green with high density. But there's also an underlying sense of guilt, where the shape of the building looks like nature, so it looks like a biological process, even if it's not, and that would sort of tranquilize it. But just to say that we're also trying to saying, can we put together some kind of urban living with the theme of environment? And I'm not a traditionalist, but I would say that the European city, at least, has a lot of places where you have some kind of urban green. In this case, is the famous Place des Vosges in Paris, Saturday afternoon. It's something from, it's a perfect square designed in 1600 with porticos, but has a beautiful garden. It's like a big court, it's a square with tree. And I think this porosity and this idea that cities can have together a very nice environmental quality and the density, which gives also social exchange, because the other big difference is that the suburb is very often segregated in terms of social. The gated community, maybe it's not all over the world, but it's one of the, of course, it also has to do with inequality and so on. But this idea of that still we think that the space of the city should be of everybody, it's a very important thing that we give for granted, but is not granted in many parts of the world. Again, the tree metaphor, which usually, talking about the city, was at the base of the planning of this sort of satellite city. So this is taken from a book by Christoph Alexander, 1964, where he wrote an article called "A City is Not a Tree," because he thought that this way of thinking of the modern city was too simple. He takes the diagram of a tree as a hierarchical diagram, where more living units are getting into a neighborhood, an apartment, and then they get into a neighborhood, and then they get a satellite city. So there's some kind of tree topological diagram where he says the real city rather works as he calls a semi-lattice. Each node is related to more than other one node. So this idea that, for example, you have a coincidence between social interaction and neighborhood unit, which is typical of the new quarters of last century. So people should be more friends if they share that. And today, in a way, is also the base of what we call co-housing. But then if we look at the way we live, and maybe our friends do not live next door, are we sure that in the reasoning of the new city, you associate physical proximity with friendship? This is not really true. So, in a way, the argument of Christoph Alexander is that the new cities, they are too simple in their relationship, and in a way too hierarchical following this tree diagram, and the historical city had more than one connection. If one road breaks here, in this tree diagram, this node is connected to the other one just by one road. If you have roadworks here, isolated, something happens, in electrical, so you need redundancy, more than one way to get there. Redundancy is there's a new name, is also robustness, something that survives in a way changes or accidents. Many times the machine of the new city was too perfect and then was too frail, brittle. I experienced it on that. This is typical of the road network. If you don't have redundancy, you can cut off entire part of the city if something goes wrong. But I want to get to the main theme of my lecture, which is housing. This is a image from Theo van Desburg. Theo van Desburg was both a painter and architect. Somebody would recognize what is called the De Stijl movement in Holland in the beginning of last century. Mondrian, of course, as a painter, was the most famous one, starting from geometry, pure geometry, and white, black, and three basic colors, yellow, blue, and red. You even have a chair, which was the red, yellow, and blue chair by Rietveld. I don't think it's a chair, I think it's a sculpture, but it's important in history of culture. So abstraction and primary colors, and at that time this was also called neoplasticism, it was some kind of artistic movement, was applied to the house. In this you have something else. The idea that the traditional view of a building as affected by gravity, so somehow a building has a diagram where gravity goes down to the ground, so some kind of pyramidal composition is negated. If a building becomes a pure artwork, you can turn it upside down. So the fact that the elevation are turned upside down, it means, in a way, you free the building for all the obligation of gravity. In a way, it's a strange object because it's a house, but also an art piece. In a famous writing, whose name is Architecture, I think it's 1910, Adolf Loos was a Viennese architect, which was very seminal. He touches in a very deep way this dilemma. Is a house art? Without quoting directly, I paraphrase the very important insights of this paper. Adolf Loos says, let me take you to a lake, a mountain lake. Everything is beautiful. The sky is blue. The clouds are white. The mountains are green. Everything looks like it's made like God. And even the little villages and the church, up there, it looks like a natural passage. Then something ruins or breaks, hurts this landscape. The house by the architect. He says, why the house of the architect, being him a good or bad architect, is ruining the landscape? The house of the peasants or the mountaineer does not do that. And he says, and not even the boat of the engineer who crosses the lake. The house of the architect is ruining the landscape because it has what you call Kunstwollen, artistic will. It's not conceived as a shelter, it's conceived, it has pretense of being art. Then he says, how does a peasant build his house? He goes to the river, he chooses the stones from the river, then he puts the mortar, and then he goes to the wood, he cuts the wood, then he puts one stone over the other, he has to do the roof. Is it a beautiful roof? He don't know. It's as beautiful as his cow or his horse. So he makes some kind of, it's more a parable than this. It's like a state of almost Rousseau-like innocence of the peasants who is not making his house to make it beautiful, or the kind of beauty he seeks is an artisan's beauty, something well made, to do something, which resists in time, but not to express anything, but protection. He says the architect's goal is not anymore this, is to tell you something. So in a way, if the house of the peasants is well done and beautiful only because it's a tool, the architect wants to tell you something with architecture. It's a message. The semantic element is a bit bigger. And then he says something interesting. He says, people expect from the house protection. They work all their life and expect some kind of solidity. So they expect solidity, in a way, some kind of fundative element from the house. And he says, art wants to rip you away from security. He says, the house has to please everybody. The art only has to please only his master. The art is revolutionary. The house is conservative. Therefore, house, and he says architecture is not art. Then he says, can we say in a polemic way, architecture is not an art? Maybe only a small fragment of what is architecture is art. He says the tomb and the monument, which means something which has a physical space, which their main goal is to express something, a monument that is less of a shelter. So in a way, Adolf Loos takes back the house to the idea of shelter. He accuses the modern architect, whether they're good or bad, not to do houses, but to do art pieces. This image, in a way, could synthesize the will of the architects to use shelters to make art. This is the house of the architect. This is the house of the people. There's a song by Leonard Cohen, it's called There Is a War. And is there a war between this and the previous one? This is a house I pictured in Oak Bluffs. Oak Bluffs is a place in Martha's Vineyard, today a fashionable island near Nantucket. And in the end of the 1800s, a group of Methodist people met there and they prayed. It was a summer religious camp. Then they liked each other and they transformed the camp into a semi-permanent place. They bought prefabricated houses, which came with all this decoration, and it's a fantastic neighborhood of 200 of these houses. Now it's a landmark of what you would dream, like a little bit Polly Pocket dream house. They're very, very conserved. People are very proud. I could say if the previous image, in a way, expressed in an extreme way the house which tries not to be a house but only art, this expresses the extreme of all the coziness, prettiness you would want to a house. Which one would you buy? That's an interesting question. If you had 500 euros, I don't know how much this cost, I probably would feel nice to stay in this porch, reading the newspaper or whatever. But I use this as two extreme images, the house by the architects and the house by the people. There is a war, in a way, or a misunderstanding. This is a picture I took in Pessac. Pessac was a famous, Le Corbusier is in the suburbs of Bordeaux. It's called Quartier Refuge. Le Corbusier went to an enlightened industrial person, and he built this sort of newly conceived, in a way suburban, because it's houses of 2 floors. Very interesting. I don't explain that, but this is the present state. So the abstraction of Le Corbusier, some part of it are restored, even with the original colors Le Corbusier did. So there's one house that looks like restored like Le Corbusier, but most of the people lived there for probably 100 years, and in a way they put tiers. So if the windows are the eyes of the house, the people conceive windows as squares, perfect geometry. The people, you have almost a physiognomic of the house. So this is a house that cries. Somebody's tried to transform Le Corbusier in something which expresses coziness or personalization and so. This is an interesting picture. When I was a student in this university and I went to listen to the lectures of my professors, many times the lectures had a theoretical character, and then I went on the magazines to see the realized work, them as professionals, in this case architects, and many times I was very disappointed by the distance between what they taught and what they did. The problem of what is education in a university is a deep one. There's a lot of debates of conventions about it. And to simplify it, one could say this. The power of human knowledge generated some abstract instruments, certainly in the sciences, which start from the observation reality but transcends it. Mathematics is a typical tool which is very powerful because of its abstraction. There's a film about the first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong, in these days, and we say, we sent a man on the moon, sometimes he said. The mathematics did. It's incredible how you can make calculation to get an exact point of the moon. I'm still amazed by that. In the field of architecture, the cathedrals were built with empiricism. Many cathedrals fell down, so the aesthetics of the cathedrals, which are very advanced, in a way, are reached not by abstract sciences, but there was a moment where the science of material and what we call statics, they got abstract status, which means a university is not just a professional school. It introduces some elements which are more distant from the empiricism reality, but maybe this is also the powerfulness of it, with the risk of detaching itself from reality. A famous definition by Adolf Loos, the architect I quoted before, is an architect is a bricklayer who learned Latin. This dilemma between the bricklayer and the architect as a culture person is a deep one in the medieval cathedrals, in the Renaissance, and in modern times. I will not touch it. Which means the second part of my lecture will do an incredible change in height, like a plane zooming down from 11,000 feet to 100 feet, and will open to you the personal side of your professor, showing empirically how do I respond to the same problems I raised in the first part of the lecture. What I'm trying to say is that there is no direct consequences between one and the other. Those problems are general problems, cultural problems, and then we found ourselves in a physical place, with a personal client, in a site, with a budget, and so on. I will purposely leave the tone of the first part of the lecture and tell the things as they are. Many times when I talk with critics and they judge my architecture, and I said, Cino Zucchi, did you do these things because you were thinking about Nordic empiricism filtered by the experience of Gioponti? I respond realistically, no. That window is there because it has to be 2.5 meters from the electrical building. I mean, many times, if you read a built work as a poetics, you totally miss it. Many, many times, you just try to solve very concrete problems. Today, for example, the regulations are very important. So, of course, the end product is something which needs to walk with its own feet. The condition which produces it, they are forgotten, and then what is there. But to get there, you have to go through all this, and sometimes it's very heavy. So I don't think many times it's very interesting to talk of architecture. Many, say, art critics, they talk of architecture as it would be a pure art. And I think they're not really describing things as they are. So I start bottom up to show some concrete experiences. Some are quite old. This is 1904. Starting from this theme, which is more present in the northern countries. Many young architects from Holland or Belgium, they start to do single-family houses. And in Italy, it's not so much of it, but still. This is a house done for a private client. Actually, I had a student who went to Erasmus. He went to Barcelona. He came back, and his uncle told him, Abbiategrasso is a town near Milano, to design his suburban house. He was not yet a licensed architect, and he came to me and proposed me to do the job together. So it was, almost. And I accepted. And the strange thing is that he started out with a project who was very much into some kind of the Barcelona movida kind of feeling. And there was a disjoint because his uncle really had in his mind an image which was the typical Italian suburban house with slanted roof, with copper tiles and so on. Not copper, sorry, terracotta tiles. So there was a total mismatch between the response, in a way a little bit naive response of a student who wants to do his first project, and the things. So I remember a moment I said, hey, this guy is expecting a roof. And in the bars of Abbiategrasso, the geometry, it's hard to translate geometry. Geometry is a figure you can also have in Italy, saying, oh, the house will leak all over, it has no roof, and so on. So I understood that somehow, the funny thing that I took this first sketch project and I re-gave him, even if the overall abstraction is high, some qualities. So I thought the icon of the roof had to appear, but the interesting thing is that I think the suburban houses always tends to sit in the middle of the lot. This was a very long lot with the sun orientation. And usually, the distance between the house, the pavilion and house, in respect to the neighbor is like 3 meters or 5 meters, and usually is worth nothing. So what I try to do is, in a quite narrow plot, to give quality to the open space, which usually Italian houses do not have. Also, Christopher Alexander, the person I mentioned before, he wrote an interesting book, translated in Italian, which is called Spazio di relazione, spazio privato, relationship space and private space, which compares different types of dwellings, say quarters, together, and he really reasoned about these things. But one of the arguments of the book is this. The pavilion house, I mean the single house overlooking out on four sides, it comes from an English tradition of a house in a countryside. So it really had a very, very big garden. Then when we start making the suburbs, we took this paradigm and we should have make it smaller, smaller, and then instead of looking a beautiful English garden, you just see a fence and your neighbor's house. So he says the collapsing scale of this model creates a paradox. You have windows open to a landscape and now they're just open to your neighbors. So his proposal, in a way, is to reverse. He makes an experimental project doing patio houses to save the green, but sort of flipping inside out. I will not talk about that. So this is a suburban house which tries to all go, instead of sitting in the middle, to push on a side. This is the car. And you enter, and in a way, to create some kind of protective space. So it's the displacement of the house. There's also a question of sun orientation. So in a way, we gave a big canopy on the outside to put the ping-pong table, to have dinner. So the house is quite straightforward. It's a typical suburban house. But the idea is that can you not totally reform, because it obeys to the normal condition of a suburban house, but to give something more, which is a space which is not just the leftover between the size of the plot, what we call piani di lottizzazione, production plots. Basically, they do many plots and they put a little rectangle in the middle of it, and the rest is there. So, in a way, it's an Italian. Then you have a break. Abbiategrasso is, the Po River Valley. This is an old project. Then another similar project is I'm explaining the occurrences how things happen. Many, many years ago, I went to give a lecture in Croatia, and a Dutch professor said, Cino Zucchi, what you said is very interesting. Sooner or later, give something, I don't know, we would like to work together with you something. 3-4 years later, he calls me up. He was from Architecten-CE. It's a quite important Dutch things. And I said, we did a master plan in a small town. It's called Enschede. And there was, actually, there was a firework industry which blowed up. So this is what is called Museumland. Is in a way is a boulevard in a suburban quarter. They planned this quarter. And in a way, they planned, again, the plots we were talking about. But then on the main boulevard, they felt they needed some more stately architecture. So the rules of the plan was that if you want to build on this main boulevard, you have to go to a set of an architect which was approved by the master planning. In Holland, the architects have more power. And in this case, they suggested my name to the client. So it was a private client with private money, but if you want to build there, you had to get an architect they approved. So there was a strong control. And then the master plan asked for suburban houses. These were quite normal suburban houses. In this case, they had some kind of setback. They have rules about how to put the volume. They were suburban houses that could still, as single pieces, but they need to contribute to some kind of mansion feeling to that. This is my client, this is his wife, and this is Fritz van Dongen. He's the one who designed the Whale. In the Borno-Sporeburg, you have this big building, it's called the Whale, from Architects.ca. This is the afternoon in Amsterdam. These two people came down to present themselves, say, I'm Mr. Veralderen, this is my wife. I'm a dentist, I work all my life. Now I put away 300,000 euros to build a house. And it's the house of my dreams, I say, for my family. We have 2 kids, like this. And he described in half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, the whole matter. Then, I say, I thank you. I'm really grateful. You described very well. Then, do you have something, some desires or some kind of inspiration? Say, no, we were never there. We came all the way here from Holland. you know, your famous architect. We don't. No, no, please. No, no, we will never do that. No, please. Then this lady takes out quite shyly a house and garden and said, I would like maybe a terrace like this. And I told them, okay, maybe I will not do exactly the way you indicated, but then this to me is important. 20 days later, I take a plane, I go to Amsterdam, and in the morning in the studio of Frits van Dongen, I present to the client with the supervision of the architect the project. Then in this afternoon, they took us to this nice, in a way, romantic tour of Amsterdam, and this guy said, Cino Zucchi, let's have a glass of wine together. Because you don't know how nervous I was this morning driving down from Enschede. It's 2 hours, it's almost on the border of Germany. Because while I was driving, I was thinking, today I will see the design for my house. I spent all my money, who I put in 20 years of work in my house, and if I don't like the project, how could I say to architect I don't like it? Now I saw the project, it's the house of my dreams, thank you so much, I was so happy. I got almost, not crying, but you know, so moved, and I said, see, I know that this project will be published because other renowned architects are there, but to me, this is your house, it's the house of your wife or your kids or your cat. I will never cheat you to publish on Domus magazine on a house. So I did a very normal house, respecting some other people. For example, Van Egerath was in front of me. He did a very Stonehenge house. Van Egerath is a Dutch architect. So I try to deal with the idea of everyday life, not on things, except in a way, in a very Losian way, to accept that a house is a house. Try to maximize the environmental qualities of it, but not try to make into artwork to publish on a magazine. I know it will not be published on Aphasia or whatever. That's a house. It has a parking with 2 cars, a pantry and inside entrance, a breakfast room with some outside space. In Holland, people like to eat on the outside, they don't fence off. A very, very big kitchen with a dining room overlooking. And the house, it's on the corner, so it embraces a small garden. You enter from there. You have, let's say, a more formal dining room, a TV room with a big sofa, and in the end project I did a TV which can turn around. So in the winter you can stay there with a lot of cushions too. Yeah. A small study room for him, and the typical Dutch bathroom that when you enter you have a small service bathroom, and a stair which starts from here but also has a fireplace and a little small stairs for the kids to shortcut, to not go through it. So in a way, it's not gigantic, but it's a big house. And this is the front elevation. I used brick, and I used, let's say, sort of dark clay looking brick. This is the original back elevation, which was supposed to be all of glass, back painted in different ways. This is a more study model. We do models like you do, so it's made of cardboard, it's not very sophisticated. And this is what it looks like on the street. The plan had for example, this section was given. One thing you can notice here, which is very typical of Dutch society, is there's no fences, and also American. In Italy, this will never be. So maybe because of tradition, in Holland, you could almost walk and bang and even go to the house and eat something, and it's very usual to have breakfast here with the neighbors. You know, the sociology of the ground floor space is totally different. So this is an important distinction we still have. The young generation is evolving lifestyles, but still now, no house in Italy could not have this condition of openness. In an interesting way. This is the corner. So say this is a breakfast room, the kitchen is here, the entrance is here. This is a house by, I think this is Bollese Wilson, and on the other side you don't see is Van Egerath. It's nothing special. I mean, they're very small houses. This one has a little bit of a turn corner, so he has a small third floor with the daughter's room, and this is the garage. I don't have very good pictures of this house. You see that the brick plays an important role. I even did the horizontal slabs. I use a brick as a casa forma, as a formwork. a glimpse on the back. For economical reason, this was original glass, and then I use oxidized zinc into slightly different tones. So this is, let's say, the side entrance and the back room. And I don't have a final thing. The back side is still under construction, so this feeling of embracement. And just to say that this sort of front-back theme is also a question of domestic and not, but also some kind of formal. This use of zinc, which is a very cheap material, you make roofs, but something in a warm, oxidized color. So the idea that the back side is informal family life. I don't have a very good picture of the interior. This is the stair going up the fireplace and this sort of side stair. But the fact that the stair is close to the side, it gives very, very nice look on the outside. I never took good pictures. I mean, these windows, they give a lot of light on interior. So this is not yet a lived-in house. And the other day I said, I have no picture of the finished house. You know, can you send me some picture with, you know, the way it is? And, you know, they put some nanetti da giardino, little, and that. So in a way, that's a suburban area they put. I'm not controlling the chair they put. You know, there's a very famous anecdote by Adolf Loos of the architect who controls the little, you know, things they put on the table. This sort of fascism of the architect controlling everybody. So once you give them, and sometimes they call me up and they say, we have to change this, what do you think of the color? You know, you put a Christmas decoration or whatever, so the house performs well, they love it, and so on. It's a house, it's nothing. Going from the small scale to bigger ones, I just will show you some examples. This is an interesting one. It's a project they commissioned in Faenza, which is still in Emilia-Romagna side. And the strange thing is that the master plan, I don't have here an image of the master plan, was prescribing two-floor buildings with trying to pick up the fabric of the historical Faenza, even if this is a suburb. It was an ideological way. And in the historical Italian towns, many times you have small plots in depth with maybe 1-2 floors. Okay. The thing is that the idea that the plan could reproduce the historical fabric did not take into account that the rules and regulations today, even the size of houses are completely different. This is true. If you go to London, you have many Georgian houses on 3-4 floors, and maybe there are 300-400 square meters, the bourgeois houses, and now they divided. Some people live on the basement, so the stair, which was internal, was transformed into common stairs. Almost each floor became a separate houses, so this elaboration. So this was a new house, which was supposed to be on this sort of plot. So in the plan, each of these try to pick up the rhythm. Even if it was a Unitarian project, you see this depth rhythm, which was trying to reproduce this sort of townhouse of historical towns. But, you know, each plot, in a way, had to go up 1 floor, and it had 8 units, where in the old time was there. So you enter here, each of these is one separate unit, so you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 units. So there was some kind of strange relationship with the real typology and the ideal one. This generated a very high density, but in the historical houses, many times the same family lives in. In this case, you had an outlook of this family, which was not that family. So we had to guarantee privacy even in this sort of tightness fabric. I share this idea of a tightness of a fabric, just to say that it was somehow, one thing is to live into a renewed house. You can accept, like Casa Ballatoio, a Milano, you have many external gallery houses. People live in it, but the people, you would not do something like that today. Aldo Rossi tried to do it in Galleratese, but all the window rollers are, if you go to the Galleratese today, on the side of the Ballatoio, the external gallery, people keep the window shut down because they will not like people walking in front of the apartment. So, and these are the options. This is the upper floor, and you have this. This is just a study model of the balcony, and the section is quite clear. You enter, you have this stair also going down to the cars, historical, so you have a common things, and you go down, and you see the distance, which is in a way close to the historical situation, but today the problem of privacy is stronger. So this is a rendering of the interior courtyard, and also for some reasons we unified the courtyard, so the plots are separated on the ground floor, because all these are single units, and then on the upper floor we try to give these oversized balconies to give some privacy, even if there's a lot of introspection. This is a project. I don't have recent pictures because it just finished. It was a very big area in Lovino is a town on the Lago Maggiore, and this was the famous Ceramica di Lovino. It was a factory, and the cover of the soil was like 90%. But the situation was incredible because it was a lakefront, and it was at the end of the boulevard. So a small town, there's a boulevard here, and the gate of the factory was here. They made a master plan, very complicated urban history, and then they made a competition to redo the master plan on the base of the numbers, so it is a thing. And this was our competition to respond to the master plan. The theme is to design the houses, because this was transformed into a hotel and a residential quarter, but also to design the lakefront. So this is like an end garden to the side. This was the competition brief. So these were houses, and this is the base of existing factory and, say, a hotel, here a residence hotel, and then you had a beautiful situation. But in Italy, this is quite incredible. This followed the indication of a master plan we don't do, so the overall quantities and volumes were not decided by us. But the main issue was to create a garden in the end of this boulevard and then you could generate also the passeggiata, the walk there. This is the existing wall, and this is housing. The side of the lake, of course, was very precious from the point of view, but it was also south-oriented. So all the apartments, they all look out. You have some kind of, let's say, notch. This is a small apartment, and these are two apartments go through with some stair blocks. So mostly the type is one stair block and elevator block serving 3 cells, where the smaller ones, 1-bedroom apartments, overlook there. So everybody got the lake view because of course, the view, and also because of the sun orientation. This is the elevation on the lake. Study models and renderings. This was the competition phase. We did not win the competition, but they liked this part, so they decided to not have one winner, to have a master plan, then more than one architect worked on a thing. So this was these 3 plots they gave us. So it's very important because they generate the new facade, and this is just finished thing. Of course, the theme is oversized loggias. The garden was not designed by us, was designed by Gustafson Porter, with some troubles because they didn't finish completed designs. Many of these situations are really controlled by economics, so many times the reduction of the cost. We managed to have stone, white stone, on the front side, and you have little shops and the porticos. So these are apartments with a base portico, and since thing steps down, it goes up. So it's the front row of intervention. And of course, the theme of, I don't want to call it picturesqueness, is there, because this environment is very delicate. It was very important modern intervention into this. You see, we managed to have some kind of stone front, and then this is plaster, because we could spend the money here, and we felt you needed something. With some kind of variation of color, a little bit of variation of loggias. Sometimes you have metal loggias. And you have all the delicacy of a question of scale, but also a little bit of language with historical. Because this is at the end of the promenade. We had a quite sophisticated idea to insert in colors. Sadly, they didn't do exactly the way it was. we did some permutation of colors to colors the loggias. And in the original thing, it was two contrasting colors, and this was a setback. Then for money reasons, they decided to do that. So it didn't come out really. It was like a stripe of orange with the front slab of light blue, and it was a permutation. It's not the only color. We gave a sort of vibration on the second thing. So we decided to accept a certain degree of decoration, I would say. So this was meant to be on a setback and orange. So it was like this overlapping the other one. The apartments are quite nice and airy. I mean, I have to say that they have a very nice environmental quality. And this is the back side. And in the back side, we try to produce the feeling of like a village. So it's light gray plasters, and the windows are three different colors: light brown, light blue, and green. And these are the entrances. There's a side difference to the shops enter from that side. You have a connection, but most of you enter from this side. So the cut is where the entrance is. I didn't do this. I find it is a little bit heavy, but you see this sort of funny double face project. With the back side is very different to the right side. This is this sort of notched in, so it's the common stair. And in Italy, it's very common to have also these houses with the not an enclosed stair block, but the stair block which is a bit there. We try to reproduce some of this quality. So this is looking up from this sort of entrance with this sort of screen and bigger windows. Going again from the small scale to the big one, this is a project in Helsinki, and it was a close competition. Stephen Hall won the first prize. I don't know if they ever did it. And it was a very strange situation because it was a former military barrack of public things. So they needed a housing to go to the free market. So it was the public company of owning public land decided to make real estate. But it was near to the lake, but sort of closed in. And this is an east-west situation. Of course, Helsinki is a place where climatic things matter very much, even if lifestyle is quite different. Of course, you have the sun in the winter is really, really low. So the search for the sun, it gives you, sometimes in the Mediterranean, you have to protect yourself from the sun. On the contrary, every inch of sun you need it. The plot was very narrow, sorry. So you enter from here, you had a common sauna, because Finnish people like very much a sauna, and the only gap you could look up is here. So it's a very linear body, very simple project. The ground floor is full of little artisan shops and a common like swimming pool and a deck in an air plot. So you enter from the entrance, pedestrian entrance from here, but here you go down to the cars. And you see you have, again, stair blocks with some kind of combination, and all this is west, which is very precious in this kind of climate. So the east side is mostly bedrooms. It's well oriented because east-west is a good orientation, but the Finnish like a lot the west as a living place. So the morning stays, the sun stays on this side, on the other side. Things. So this is the most plain east side with mostly bedrooms, with some, not only bedrooms. And the west side is characterized by this veranda. This is a quite common theme in if you go in Helsinki, all the external balconies, they can be screened off. So the question is, they have a whole technology how to fold the windows. And the particularity was a competition. We tried to extend this sort of deck into the garden. This is the common sauna. And from time to time, we have these almost linear balconies going in the middle of the birch tree park. We are in Milano, and we have a particularity. Milano developed a quite interesting typology of relating the housing to the city. So again, my concern is not just the type of the dwelling, but the in-between spaces. This is true talking about facade, terraces, the interface between, and also on the ground floor, if you can make common spaces, how you touch the ground floor, which is a fundamental thing. This is a map of Milano the Second World War, with all the maps of the bombings. And you see Milano, this is San Lorenzo. You see Milano was quite heavily bombed. So in the Second World War, the idea was to reconstruct also the center on the base, not completely, of the existing trace on the ground. And this is an example of one master plan of a particular place, which is Corso di Porta Romana, Corso Italia, and by Piero Bottoni. In this case, the white ones are the new buildings, and the gray ones are the existing buildings. So you see a particularity that the trace of the street is more or less what it was. This is the Navigli, Via Santa Sofia. There's a setback. Actually, the historical house or the new house is set back a bit, so it's not literally what it was there. And then you have a model with higher rise, say a lower rise base, which picks up the scale of the existing buildings, and a high rise usually perpendicular to it. And in the middle of the garden, sometimes you have a more open architecture. So in a way, it's a compromise, or try to put together the best of worlds. The idea that you need light, air, detachment, we generate the new quarters, but also the idea that the street is an important factor and you need continuity. Bottoni, even in the new quarters he designed, he was talking about strada vitale, living street. He thought also sociologically, he reinserted the idea of a street in a Le Corbusier kind pattern, which had no streets, in a way, but just slabs. So this experience, which was somehow considered compromising in a Second World War, there's a famous article by Rainer Banham, he was an English critic, and he was something like in the 50s and said, he's talking about the Torre Velasca, and he said, the Italian retreat from modern architecture, criticizing Torre Velasca, saying it's not modernism, about materials, about the volumes. And Rogers, he was one of the BBPR and also the director of Casabella, answered and says, answer to the custodian of Frigidaires. This sort of white thing. This interesting polemics is more a stylistic one. In this case, urbanistically, today many people from Northern Europe schools, they come to Milano to see some kind of urban modern. It's considered, you have even a tourism about it. This is Piero Bottoni rendering of the building he did in Corso Buenos Aires. It still is there, even if it's not really completely designed with it. It's not such a beautiful building, to be sincere, but it expresses his idea that you have a high-rise tower and you have a base which relates to the street front. So this sort of double strategy. This is a building by Gustavo Vitolatis. I was born here. I married the girl next door here, now I live here, and I wrote a book about Osnagavender. So this image represents the galaxy of Cino Zucchi. In 30-meter radius I have my life. This tree, this is a picture more or less the age I was born. This tree now is this high. And you see no cars. This was the pattern of the cars at that time. So this building has only 3 garages. Now we're going back to having no cars. This is interesting. This time only rich people had cars. This picture tells. Then the size and the number of the garage was totally missed from what it now. And now people start not having any more cars. It's an interesting evolution. And the building survived through this. This is my balcony. The panels by Lucio Fontana. So I live here. And I look to next door to an Osnagavender building. This was a mixed-use housing and offices, and this is the palace from the 1500s. So you see here, even if there's a slight setback, there's an attempt of getting the scale, and this is even a high-rise building built keeping the facade of the 1500s. So this sort of strategy of trying to include things, we generate an interesting landscape. And even if belonging to this model, the most spectacular, strange occurrence is by Luigi Moretti, in a way this sort of blade or slab, which has a north, this is only the kitchens, so it has a very close side, but the base goes along Via Rugabella. So even if this is a very peculiar building, in a way it's extreme personalization of this model by Bottoni, having, it's not just a high-rise, it's a high-rise on a base which even follows the street line and creates some kind of continuity with the street. This is another Asnagavender building. It's in Via Verga. Actually, I did a book on Asnagavender some years ago, and then now they became very famous. All the Northern School come. Many times under my house, I see every week there's some students photographing the building next door, and Adam Caruso, with the students of ETH in Zurich, did a book on Asnagavender, and on the cover you have this building. In this building is a later building. You see an historical architecture, and I remember reading the report, Asnagavender are talking about this idea that the piece of the building keeps the street line, and then you have a portico and you have a setback. So again, light and air, and even the strange theme of a roof line, together with, so in a way it's modernism put together with roofs. It's a strange and interesting, in a way, approach. Okay, this is my book, and this is Adam Caruso. You see the house we were talking about. So some kind of local heroes, or even not so well-known architects, as Navarrete were not so well-known. Now, Milano is in the center of attraction, is a case of with Magistretti, Cacciadominioni, of this international relevance, because people like the language of architecture of Milanese Second World War, but also this sort of urban strategy. So again, the buildings which have a residential quarter which become the backdrop of our lives. This is buildings I see from my Vespa coming to the university. It's pictures I took, and then I gave it to Delfino Sistiniani. What's her name? We did it for the Biennale installation. It's just the idea that a facade is not just the expression of the interior, as rationally thought, but is also the backdrop of our life. This is the main center of our architectural research when we do multifamily houses. Can we consider this as texture? So you respond to the individual need of having light and air, and then size of the windows. On the other side, so these are sunscreens, but on the other side, this whole thing becomes the backdrop public space. Can we both respond to these two conditions creating these interfaces? I think this is the main goal of the project of apartment buildings, and I would give this as a theme to you when you design, in our situation, the public space and the private space as much. This idea of inhabited screen, you could say these are screens which are dwelled in, but also they give unity to all the single life. Everybody can put objects or their own flowers here, or air conditioning, but in the end, the sum of this will not generate a city. So can we conceive facades not only as theatrical pieces of the outside as Baroque architecture did, not only as the expression of the inside as functionalist, but some kind of mediator element. I would stop here, and I would have another coffee, and maybe next time we will go on like that.